Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. And we're so pleased to have you here with us today for the first installment of this year's Yiddish Civilization Lecture Series. This is a series which is both a part of the instruction for our Yiddish summer program, for which we're teaching many dozens of students come to YIVO from around the world to study Yiddish with us for 6 weeks. It's a tremendous program that we've been doing for a very long time. We're very proud of it. And this lecture series is both a part of the curriculum for this program, and it's also open to the broader public, and it's a way for us to share the wonderful learning that's happening at YIVO each summer with all of you out there. So thank you all so much for joining us. Today's lecture is titled The Drama of Russian Jewry in the Long 20th Century. We're very pleased to have with us Professor Zvi Gitelman, who is the Preston R. Tisch Professor Emeritus of Judaic Studies and Professor Emeritus of Political Science at University of Michigan. Professor Gitelman studies ethnicity and politics, especially in former communist countries, as well as Israeli politics, East European politics, and Jewish political thought and behavior. His most recent edited book is The New Jewish Diaspora, Russian-Speaking Immigrants in the United States, Israel, and Germany. In 2012, Cambridge University Press published his Jewish Identities in Post-Communist Russia and Ukraine, An Uncertain Ethnicity, which drew on 2 large surveys that he conducted with 2 colleagues in Russia. Gitelman is co-editor of a forthcoming volume on Jewish thought, politics, and literatures in the interwar period. And he is writing a book on ethnic relations in Soviet armed forces and the partisans during the war and Soviet policy regarding the Holocaust. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Zvi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Schönen herzlichen Dank, Alex. Ich habe gemeint, als öfter will ich reden Jiddisch heutzutage, aber ich will probieren reden English. Thank you very much. I am very pleased, I would say also honored, to participate in this program. My acquaintance with YIVO and my various kinds of affiliations with it goes back to approximately 1960, so I am more than delighted to be here. The story of Soviet Jewry, which is only really about 75 years, is a most dramatic one, and I think it's very relevant and meaningful to an American audience because it's generally estimated that about 80%, 4 out of 5 American Jews, have their roots in the old Russian Empire and then in the Soviet Union. If you reflect on what the antecedent generations and the recent generations have gone through, your parents, your grandparents, great-grandparents, they have experienced tremendous turbulence, oppression, repression, but also upward social mobility and great achievements in various walks of life. Let's take someone who was born around 1904 and in the Russian Empire and lived to age 88, that would be 1992. That person would have experienced the following: the Revolution of 1905, World War I, 2 revolutions in the year 1917, and between 1918 and 21, in the so-called Civil War, which was anything but civil, the death by various armed groups of about 50,000 Jews, followed by widespread famine in Ukraine in 1932-33, totalitarian Stalinism, collectivization of agriculture, and the purges, which resulted in the unnatural deaths of millions of Soviet citizens, World War II and the Shoah. Unbeknownst to most Westerners and Israelis, I would say, about 40% of all the victims of the Shoah were Soviet citizens in 1941. That war was followed by harsh, repressive Soviet policies between 1948 and 52, which put paid to the Soviet myth that it was free of ethnic prejudice and repression. And following the death of Stalin in March 1953, we had what many Soviets called время zastoy, meaning the period of stagnation, presided over by Leonid Brezhnev, then the head of the Communist Party. That, in turn, was followed in the middle of the 1980s by the ascendancy of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev and the end of the Cold War, winding up with the collapse of the Soviet system in 1991. With that dissolution of that great superpower came the possibility and the reality of the reconstruction of Jewish public life, which proceeded at an amazingly rapid pace. However, simultaneous with that reconstruction came massive emigration of the Jews. By and large, my impression is that in the West and in Israel, the Russian-Soviet Jewish experience is seen as a tragic and dark age. That view serves many Jewish ideologies, but it is an incomplete and oversimplified one. Sorry, Alex, I don't see myself.
We see you.
Can I see me?
That's a question on your computer, if rearranging what you have there. But we see you just fine.
Okay. I see enough of myself. Over the course of 7 decades, Soviet Jews experienced radical oscillations in their social, economic, political lives, and in their cultures. And I use that word in the plural deliberately. There were ups and downs, lights and shadows. Before the revolution, and remember that Jews were admitted to the Russian Empire only in 1795 because the Tsars rejected them on religious grounds. The Jews had, after all, killed Christ. During the Tsar's period, Jews were politically and economically oppressed, geographically isolated into the 15 western provinces of the Russian Empire, the so-called Pale of Settlement, in Hebrew Tchum HaMoshav, in Russian Cherta Asiedlosty. But the Jews were religiously and culturally free. And that freedom allowed them to create 2 modern secular literatures, Hebrew and Yiddish, religious movements, and though constrained, political ideologies and parties, Zionism, Bundism, territorialism, and to adhere to general movements such as socialism, constitutional democracy, and even anarchism. Jews reacted to the repressive regime, I would say, in 4 ways. A small minority struggled for civil rights and believed that Russia could be reformed and made at least a constitutional monarchy. A far larger group simply left. They gave up on Russia. They emigrated, about almost 2 million Jews between 1882 and 1912. And that emigration vastly populated North America, Western Europe, and what was to become Israel. So they simply gave up on Russia. A third way of dealing with the repression was to adhere to socialism, which was considered a worldwide panacea. Capitalism, after all, was the cause of racial, religious, and ethnic tensions because rapacious capitalists pitted one ethnic group against another in order to divide the working class and prevent it from rebelling against the capitalist system. People who became socialists had given up on all states that existed between 1917 and looked to create a de-ethnicized, class-determined political system and whatever flowed from that in economics and culture. The fourth response was Zionism. That simply gave up on all countries other than a not yet existing self-governing, independent Jewish state. Zionism was not created in a vacuum. It emerged, even though Jews had clung for centuries to visions of return to the land of Israel, but it emerged in its modern form under the influence of the Romantic nationalism, which in the late 19th century had led to the reunification or the unification of Germany, of Italy, the consolidation of France, and of course, spurred the national movements among people such as Ukrainians, Poles, Slovaks, Croats, Macedonians, and the like. As we say in Yiddish, wie es Christelsach as Edelzach, an untranslatable pun, which means as it goes with the Christians, so it goes with the Jews. Jewish history has never been spun out in a vacuum. Let's move quickly to the Soviet period. Here the oscillations are dramatic and most clear. The period begins with the liberation of the oppressed Jews, reconstruction of Jewishness in a way hitherto unknown anywhere, followed by repression, once again followed by liberation, and again by reconstruction in a new way in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and culminating, perhaps that's the wrong word, you'll judge for yourselves later on, culminating in mass emigration. In 1926, the population, Jewish population of the Soviet Union was about 2.7 million. Can we see the first slide, please? (1926) was chosen because it was the first Soviet census. In 1939, 40, 41, about 1.5 million Jews had become Soviet citizens because the USSR annexed Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and 2 areas from Romania, but Bessarabia and Bukovina. So the Jewish population on the eve of the war approached something like 5 million. After the Shoah, in which approximately 2.7 million Jews were murdered, as you see in the first post-Soviet census in 1959, the population was about 2.3 million. In the last Soviet census taken in 1989, the population had declined dramatically to less than 1.5 million. It's difficult to estimate the number of Jews today in the 15 republics, states that succeeded the Soviet Union, but by some definitions, it is less than 300,000. So if we look at 1897, where the Russian Empire had the largest Jewish population in the world, over 5 million, and we look at the states that descend from it, we see a very dramatic decline. Okay, you can take down the slide. In 1917, the Jews welcomed the downfall of Tsarism, but they were ambivalent about the emergence of the Soviet communist state. Religious Jews knew of the militant atheism of the communists. Zionists were aware of the militant opposition by the Bolsheviks to any form of nationalism, including Jewish nationalism. The Bund, which had been founded in 1897 on social democratic principles, not always adhered to, was afraid, for Marxist reasons, that the Bolsheviks had seized power prematurely before there was a big enough working class to really exercise power. And they were also afraid that Lenin's autocratic style would make its imprint upon the future Soviet government. And they were right. However, in the multilateral war that took place between 1918 and 21, Ukrainian nationalists, Poles, Jews, Bolsheviks, whites, anarchists, bands which had no political ideology other than to rape and rob. In that catastrophic period, where at least 50,000 Jews died and others in large numbers emigrated, there was one effective political and armed force in the country that did not inflict pogroms, with rare exceptions, on the Jews, and that was the Bolsheviks. So as we say in Hebrew, lo me'ahavat Mordechai ela mesinat Haman. Many Jews, including Zionists, religious Jews, joined the Red Army, which was commanded by Lev Davidovich Bronstein, otherwise known as Trotsky, in order not to serve the cause of Bolshevism, but to defend themselves. The communist regime, or the Bolsheviks, in 1918, like the Bundists before them, Yiddish-speaking, decided to allow the formation of Jewish sections of the Communist Party, so-called Yevreyskie Sekции, or as the acronym Yevsekции. And their purpose was to reach out to the approximately 70 or 75% of Jews who lived their lives in Yiddish and needed to get the Bolshevik message in a language they could understand. The Yevsekции were divided, like the Bund before it, in three ways. Should we just let the Jews assimilate? Because that is the Marxist vision of the long-term fate of all the nations. They would drop their ethnicity, which was an artificial construct of capitalism, and would merge into a de-ethnicized, unreligious, unracial mass of humanity. Or perhaps we should, at least in the short run, promote a new secular Yiddish culture until such time as the Jews fully acculturate into the larger cultures. And the third option, which was known as neutralism, was let the chips fall where they may. Let us see what the social processes and the economic changes among Jews will bring about. But all looked forward to creating a new type of Jew, a Soviet Jew, who would be very different from any Jews elsewhere. So they launched a destructive campaign. Bring down the old culture and start to create a new one. The old culture rested on three pillars: Judaism, religion; Jewish national self-assertion, not necessarily only Zionism; and a sense of ethnicity, of separateness. The Jewish sections went so far as to convince the Soviet authorities that Hebrew should be banned, the only such language in Soviet history that became untaught, unlearned, untransmitted. Why? Former Bundists who had joined the Communist Party, and remember there was a Kulturkampf between Hebrew and Yiddish in the 19th century, the Haskalah, the competing literatures, writers who wrote in both languages, some who wrote in three languages. Nevertheless, there was this language conflict, which we see in many other societies. The Bundists were opposed to Hebrew and persuaded the communists that Hebrew was the language of the religious, the rabbis, the clericals, the Zionists, and the haute bourgeoisie, which dropped Hebrew phrases to show their cultural superiority and social standing, comme il faut, as we say in Turkish. This campaign led to the closing of every single Jewish school. It led to the closing of most synagogues, about 600, which were turned into workers' clubs, gymnasia, libraries, and workplaces. All Jewish parties became illegal, their members arrested, deported, some to Palestine, ironically, others to Siberia, and religious functionaries were forced to change their professions or and many were imprisoned or exiled. Having achieved the destruction of the old Jewish culture, the Jewish sections, with the party behind it, launched a campaign to build a secular, socialist, Soviet culture based on Yiddish. How was one to do so? Comrade Lenin, who was a very astute politician, remember that he died in 1924, understood that the non-Russian peoples of the empire, who constituted almost half of the entire population, were not Russianized sufficiently to understand Russian-inflected Bolshevism. They had to be reached out in their native languages and cultures. And this was a policy of korenizatsiya. In Russian, koren means root. It was a policy of rooting Bolshevism, of implanting Bolshevism among the non-Russians, whether Ukrainians, Georgians, Uzbeks, Jews. For the Jews, that meant, of course, Yiddish. There were three programs to, let's say, solve the Jewish question. These programs lasted about a decade, from the mid-1920s until about the mid-1930s. First program was agricultural settlement. Jews had been forbidden to own land in the Tsarist Empire, and land, agriculture, was the means of living, of sustenance, of 4 out of 5 inhabitants of the empire. 80% were tied to agriculture as peasants or the families dependent on them. Jews could not have, with very few exceptions, rather exotic, could not farm the land. I heard from a Jewish activist communist who later became a hero of the Minsk ghetto that he had heard Stalin say, Tsar Yevreям землю не давал. Керенский Yevreям землю не давал. А мы дадим. The Tsars didn't give the Jews any land. Kerensky, the provisional government in 1917, didn't give the Jews any land, but we give it. Sounds very Stalin-esque. So Jews were to settle on new colonies and some old ones in Crimea, Belarusia, Ukraine, and ultimately Birobidzhan in Siberia. The idea that there would be 200,000 nouveau peasants was implemented, but their numbers declined by about half as early as 1940. It was only a partial success, and when the Nazis came, it was very easy to identify and exterminate those Jews who lived on collective farms or agricultural cooperatives. Please show the slide of Jewish settlers in the Crimea. You can see the difficult conditions under which they lived. And the one item they seem to bring from home on the back wall is a samovar. But you see that the housing was, let's say, very basic. Did these people move there out of idealism? Probably not. Probably they were so impoverished, unemployed, desperate, that they saw establishing themselves on the farms as a way to solve their economic problems. You can take that down. The second program, much more successful, was industrialization. Now, that was not a program aimed at Jews. That was Stalin's program expressed in the so-called 5-year plans to rapidly industrialize the backward, underdeveloped, mainly peasant Soviet Union, and to put it on a par with the industrialized powers of the West. Jews were delighted to follow this path because it meant higher standard of living, good jobs, and moving to the cities out of the wrecked and impoverished Städtler. By 1939, there were 500,000 Jewish factory workers, manual laborers in the Soviet Union, and there were 364,000 white-collar workers, bookkeepers, technicians, teachers, engineers, and so on. The Luftmenschen, the people without any means of making a living, the petty traders in the market towns, they were gone. They were déclassés. They had no role in the Soviet economy. Industrialization threw off enormous, truly revolutionary social consequences. One of them was urbanization. Jews flocked into the cities and from the old Pale of Settlement areas into the Russian Republic, Moscow, Leningrad, where Jews had been restricted from living in substantial numbers. These brought thousands and thousands of Jews. As a result, the Jews changed their language. In the shtetl, you could live, as my grandmother did in the Bronx for 40 years, hardly speaking any of the majority language. Everyone around you spoke Yiddish. You couldn't do that in Voronezh or even in Moscow. Jews adopted the most common language, Russian. Increasingly, Jews married non-Jews. If you compare intermarriage rates in the Russian Republic with those in the old pale areas of Belarus and Ukraine, you see that the intermarriage rates in Russia were much higher. Migration, in a word, meant acculturation, upward social mobility, and social mixing. It also meant political upward mobility. Remember that in the Tsarist period, a Jew could not be a civil service, could not even be a postman or a policeman. The idea of a Jew holding a governmental post was laughable. In the Tsarist military, there were probably 500,000 Jews during World War I, and fewer than five Jewish officers. By 1936, the highest echelons of the Red Army included Jewish generals such as Yakov Shmushkevich, who spoke Yiddish, head of the Red Air Force, Generals Grigory Stern, Yona Yakir, Yakov Kreiser, Jan Gamarnik, who was apparently related to Chaim Nachman Bialik. By the way, all of these people except Kreiser were purged in the military purges of 1937. In 1934-37, this period known as the Great Purges, 38% of the secret police elite, the NKVD, later the KGB, were Jews. Could you show the slide with the elites in the NKVD, please? No, that's it. Thank you. Look at the left column, 1934. So I did this. It took a lot of work, but I counted heads, or some would say noses. And in 1934, in the very top leadership of the secret police, you can see that there were 7 more Jews, 37, than Russians, 30. That's incredible. 39% of the leadership were Jews, more than Russians, whereas the populations were much, much smaller among Jews and greater among Russians. And you can see that this trend continues for a while, I would say till about 1938, 39. And look what happens in 39. More than 2/3 of the leadership is Russian, and only 4% is Jewish. So obviously, something based on ethnicity was happening in the late 1930s, which pushed the Jews down. But until then, they were among the highest positions in the entire system. You can take that down. The higher Soviet Jews climbed the elite ladders, the lower Yiddish culture fell. And I'm going to dwell on Yiddish because this is YIVO after all. So it's a little bit distorted in terms of the importance of various developments. When minorities migrate, as Americans know, their own languages are swallowed by the majority languages after 1 or 2 generations. That's for sure among Jews. That's why you're studying Yiddish today as a subject, rather than speaking the language fluently, writing it, reading it, hearing it, that your, I don't know, great-grandparents spoke, because Yiddish was lost in the interim generations. Now, this happened more quickly in the United States than in Canada, more quickly in England than in Mexico, more quickly in Hungary, where Hungarian was adopted, than in Lithuania. And there are good reasons why the pace of acculturation was different in every country. However, in the case of the USSR, and to some extent in the case of Israel, the loss of Yiddish was forced by policy of the government. Whereas in the other countries, the fate of Yiddish or any other language was left to spontaneous social development. Jews abandoned Yiddish for practical reasons. Many Jews, especially the young and the middle generations, associated Yiddish, which, by the way, Jews didn't respect very much. They called it jargon for a long time. They associated it with a low-class language, with a patois, with a dialect rather than a respectable language with a high cultural literature. The old shtetl speaking Yiddish was an impediment to advancement. The Moscow Yiddish newspaper, which was called Der Emes. What is Emes? Same as Pravda, truth. But the Soviets will come back to this, spelled Emes, not Aleph Mem Taf, but Ayin Mem Ayin Samech, for reasons we'll see in a minute. Emes in 1924 quotes a porter who's meeting in a trade union of Jewish porters who speak Yiddish, and he says, I don't want to speak Yiddish. The matter is very simple. For many decades, I've carried hundreds of pounds on my back, day in, day out. Now, I want to learn Russian, and then I can become a kontorshchik, a clerk, a white-collar worker. And at the same time, however, the state was promoting, funding Yiddish language and culture. In 1924, about 76 Yiddish books and pamphlets were published. By 1930, there were 531. Remember, all of these were published by the state. There was no private publishing. In the early 1920s, there were 21 Yiddish newspapers scattered around the country. In 1927, there were 40. But if you take the 3 largest newspapers, Der Emes in Moscow, Der Wecker in Minsk, the capital of Belarusia, Der Stern in Kharkov, and then in Kiev, capital of Ukraine, their total circulation was 32,000. And remember, 70% of the Jews said Yiddish was their mother tongue. Schooling. The only Jewish schools permitted after the revolution on the Jewish street were state-sponsored Yiddish secular schools. And their mandate was to educate to communism. By 1930, there were about 130 students in such schools. And no other country has there been such a state-funded network of schools. But we have to remember that in the old Pale, which was in the 1920s extremely impoverished, over a quarter of the children, the Jewish children, did not attend any school. But half of the children who did attend school attended Yiddish schools. In the Russian Republic, and remember, masses of Jews were leaving the old Pale and moving to Russia, only 17% of Jewish school children attended Yiddish schools. The trend was clear. And one reason was that secular schools had absolutely no trace of Judaism, Jewish nationhood. Bible was not taught, obviously. Hebrew was not taught. Traditions were not mentioned, except to criticize them. And even Russian history was confined to the Jews of the Russian Empire, and within that, the class conflict among Jews between the heroic proletariat and the exploitative capitalist class. They went so far as to reform the Yiddish orthography, the spelling of the Yiddish language. Can we see that slide, please? What I've done here is to show you two sentences on the right side in standard Yiddish writing and on the left in communist Yiddish writing. Don't laugh, but I made these sentences up. On the right, the top line says, Chaver Stalin is a goyen. Comrade Stalin is a genius, which he was routinely called in all Soviet media. The same thing is said on the left side. Chaver Stalin is a goyen. But notice the different spelling of each and every word, except two, the small words is and a. What's going on? There are no vowels in Yiddish, and they are substituted in Soviet Yiddish, and they are substituted by letters. Aleph for patach and komatz, two vovs for avet, and no final letters. So the word gaon in standard Yiddish, or goyen, is a nun sofit. The word goyen in Yiddish pronunciation has no final nun. Second example. Moshe Rabbeinu hat ausgetracht die Teire. Moshe, our teacher, invented or imagined the Torah. Look at the way the communists do it. Moshe Rabbeinu hat ausgetrachtet Teure. Look at how Moshe is spelled, how Teure is spelled, how Rabbeinu is spelled. Get rid of any Lashon Kodesh. Get rid of any Hebrew or religious words and terminology. And thereby separate yourself, distinguish yourself from Yiddish in the capitalist countries. There was a huge battle between, say, the Vorwärts in New York and the Yiddish writers in the Soviet Union, but that's a subject for another lecture. You can take down that slide. By the mid-1930s, Korenizatsiya was dropped as a policy. The idea was that all of the peoples of the Soviet Union, including the Jews, had learned enough Russian to be able to use it as a language of learning, and therefore we didn't need any language schools, especially among Jews who had become urbanized and acculturated to Russian. By the outbreak of World War II, almost no Yiddish schools remained in the Slavic republics. And those that existed in the Baltic republics, which had been annexed to the USSR only in 39-40, were thoroughly Sovietized. As a woman I met recently, she's 100 years old, but she went to a secular girls' Yiddish school in Vilna before the war. They learned all subjects in Yiddish. And suddenly, when Vilna becomes part of Soviet Lithuania and no longer in Poland, the curriculum changes radically, and suddenly our curriculum is songs and poems about Stalin. We were very good students, she says, and only after the war habe ich ausgefunden, als gewesen ein größer Bandit und ein רוצח. Did I find out that he was a great bandit and a murderer. So by the 1960s, Yiddish disappears. In the last Soviet census in 1989, only 11% say that Yiddish is their mother tongue. And some do it demonstratively. It's not really a language they speak or even understand, but they want to assert their Jewishness. Let's go quickly to World War II and the Shoah. You know a great deal about this topic, so I'm going to point out only those aspects of the Shoah in the USSR that seem to me to be different from other places. The Nazis' attitude toward the Soviet Union was not simply anti-Jewish. It was anti-Soviet, anti-Bolshevik, anti-communist, which it associated with Jews. Bolshevism was a creation of Jews. And as Field Marshal von Manstein said to his troops in the Wehrmacht, we are fighting a crusade against the Jewish Bolshevik system. That was not true in Holland. It was not true in France. Second, whereas, as I mentioned, over 40% of the Shoah victims were Soviet citizens as of 1941, and we knew little about it, they were not sent to camps. They were not sent to Auschwitz and Treblinka and Majdanek and so on, except for a few. They were shot in situ. They were murdered by machine guns in the places that they lived, which means that their neighbors, their non-Jewish neighbors, some of whom participated in their murder, saw exactly what was happening. In France, you didn't want the French people to see Jews being murdered, though the French were not overwhelmingly philo-Semitic. So you sent them first to Drancy, and from Drancy, you transported them to Auschwitz. Third, 500,000 Soviet Jews served in the military. Their motivation, by and large, was not to defend Jews, but to defend the Soviet Union because they were the first genuine Soviet generation, patriots who had gained a great deal from the system. In all, the Soviet Union suffered much more than any Western country during the war. 27 million Soviet citizens died, about 9 million of them in combat. Of the 18 million civilian casualties, about 2.7 million were Jews. That means that Jews were about 15% of the civilians who were killed, though Jews were only about 2.5% of the population. One final note. As I said, 500,000 Jews served in the Soviet military, about 500,000 American Jews served in the American military. The difference is enormous. Somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 Soviet Jewish combatants died. 8,000 American Jewish soldiers died. The consequences, and I'm pressed for time, so I'll have to go quickly. Consequences that Jews became disillusioned. First of all, by collaboration with the Nazis, by particularly their Ukrainian and Baltic neighbors. Terrible stories told, coming home from the war and finding out that a Ukrainian orphan boy who was adopted by a Jewish religious family, though they had 9 children of their own, because that Ukrainian boy's parents had died during the Holodomor, during the Great Famine in Ukraine. When the Nazis came and the adopting family hid underground, he ratted on them to the Germans. Many such stories, hundreds of thousands of collaborators. This put pay to the idea of druzhba narodov, friendship of the peoples. Really? The Soviet Union had eliminated anti-Semitism? Apparently not. And that was compounded by the explicit anti-Semitic policies of 1948, 1953. The closing of all Yiddish institutions, the murder on August 12, 1952, of 20 leading Jewish cultural activists. The doctor's plot of early 1953, where murderers in white coats, as the headline in Pravda had it, Jewish doctors in the Kremlin had poisoned rather than treated Soviet leaders. Why? Because they were paid by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which was itself a front for the CIA to do so. All right. Stalin dies in March of 1953. Things ease up, but the Jewish pre-war status is never achieved again. There are informal but real quotas in higher education and employment. There's exclusion from high government, party, and cultural institutions. There are campaigns beginning in 1957 under Khrushchev against religions, disproportionately against Judaism, which hardly anyone was practicing anymore. The only people who practice Judaism are Jews, and therefore, if you criticize Judaism, you are criticizing Jews. If you criticize the Jewish state, and this may ring rather contemporary to some of you, you are criticizing only one ethnic group. And the attack against Zionism is understood by Jews and non-Jews as anti-Semitism. I'll conclude by mentioning the rise of a Jewish national movement in the 1950s, but emerging in the 1960s, especially the 1967 war, where the Soviet Union backed Egypt, Syria, Iraq, who tried to destroy the Jewish state and its population. And then the Jews realize they are living in a state where they are Russians culturally, but Jews officially, because they're registered as such in their internal documents, and Jews socially. That leads to massive emigration. Please bring up that slide, that graph, please. And you see that emigration numbers fluctuate radically over time. I won't go into detail, but the reason is mainly international politics and domestic politics, both in the United States and the USSR. The sum total of this emigration is that 1.6 million Jews left the Soviet Union between 1971 and 2007. And that is a new diaspora which was created, and this is the final irony, at the very same time of perestroika and glasnost, where Jews were permitted to regain synagogues, to establish Jewish schools, to publish in Russian, a little bit in Yiddish, some in Hebrew and in Georgian language, all kinds of Jewish publications, where Jewish studies were taught in some of the biggest universities in the Soviet Union, in the former Soviet Union by then. And there was a tremendous Jewish revival. And at the very same time, and I think God has a sense of humor, at the very same time as revival, the Jews leave. Is the Russian-Soviet chapter in Jewish history now closed? And how long will the Russian-speaking Jewish diaspora maintain itself? Well, as Joseph said in the Bible, Le'Elohim pitronot. I don't have the answer. Maybe God does. Thank you.
Zvi, thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. I'm going to just jump into a few questions quickly because we don't have that much time left. Going back to the beginning of the story, how does Congress Poland fit into this long century?
Not very important. It is a kind of a fake country controlled by the Russian Empire. But as you know, Poland lost its sovereignty in 1795, regained it only in 1918, which means for 123 years, Poland did not exist as a state. The Polish language and culture were repressed. The Polish people did not assimilate. Some of them did acculturate.
And moving ahead, you showed the slide which showed the overrepresentation of Jews in the NKVD in the early 30s and how that attenuated later. And you also spoke about this German Nazi connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Soviet and anti-Bolshevik tendencies, connecting Jews and Bolsheviks. Can you unpack for us a little bit, this idea that this association and the seeming, in that statistic, it seems that Jews are kind of disproportionately involved in the mechanisms of the Bolshevik apparatus. So can you kind of unpack that for us? I mean, I've heard you do this before. But I think it's helpful for folks.
You probably remember better than I. It's only speculative because we were not able to interview the NKVD people, most of whom were themselves killed. The speculation is that those who were powerless, when they achieve power, delight in it and take revenge on their previous oppressors by using their newly acquired power. The very idea that a Jew has power, and I'm not getting into contemporary politics, is so attractive and so seductive that it's hard to desist from using it. A second possibility, and I think it's not easily dismissed, is that these Jews were idealists. They really believed in the cause, and they became infatuated as believers. And if Comrade Stalin said X was a Menshevik saboteur, you believed him. And he had to be eliminated.
And would you say that would you characterize the kind of Jewish involvement in the Bolshevik movement more broadly as perhaps attendant to some of the same motivations? This idea of it's a path to emancipation and to opportunity, and Jews perhaps particularly resonated with that.
Yes, it was a very attractive alternative to religion. And it was so idealistic in promising a world without ethnic discrimination, which Jews had felt for so long, that they embraced it, just as they embraced socialism.
Fascinating. Well, we're just about out of time. One person has asked if you can recommend any books. I know you have written on this subject. Can you just tell us a quick suggested reading list for those that want to learn more? Auf ein Fuß, as they say.
Pardon?
I said auf ein Fuß.
Auf ein Fuß? Well, modesty aside, a good overall an overall survey is called A Century of Ambivalence, The Jews of Russia from 1881 to the Present, published by Indiana University Press. And I don't remember who the author is, but he has a name similar to mine.
That's a wonderful book by the present Zvi Gitelman. And on that note, I will thank you, Zvi, so much for joining us. This was a tremendous, quick march through Russian Jewish history of the last century. We're very grateful for you for joining us and for kicking off this year's Yiddish Civilization lecture series.
Thank you, sir. And all the best to meine Freund in Yivo.